Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode. And I rarely do a breaking news segment on the FCPA compliance report, but this is about as close as we get. I'm absolutely thrilled to have Mike Huneke and Brent Carlson back to talk about something that we have talked about, the pace of change. And now we had one from the business world, not from Trump world. And it hit like a bombshell last week. We're still feeling the repercussions today. It's still front page news in the Wall Street Journal. So it is DeepSeek. And gentlemen, I'm going to ask you guys to describe what happened last Monday and as the week went on. But the import of this podcast obviously will be corporate and compliance response. So could you really, one of you guys set the stage and then let's explore what, if anything, we can do?
Sure, Tom. Happy to do so. And Brent and I are, as always, very happy to be back on the pod. The breaking news was this announcement by DeepSeek on President Trump's inauguration day, coincidentally, about significant advances that they had been able to make with their AI product. This prompted a very interesting news cycle from a compliance perspective. The initial news cycle was, oh no, export controls aren't working, so we should abandon them, and companies should just be allowed to sell more with less restriction to DeepSeek. Then you saw the counter analysis, counter narrative develop over the next kind of turn of the news page, so to speak, or as my son does, he tries to swipe right instead of turning the page and gets frustrated. Questioning, wait, is this real? What's the difference between inference training, so that what the user kind of sees, versus the model training, which really requires still a lot of heft in terms of compute, the computing power used to do it. And maybe we should have more controls and not fewer. This culminated in the testimony by the Commerce Secretary nominee, Howard Lutnick, which, contrary to some speculation, really doubled down. That took a very almost personal and competitive tone to this from an economic combat perspective and said, we are going to do more. We are going to control more. That if they want to compete with us, they being in this case the Chinese, Secretary nominee Lutnick said they can't do that with our tools. I know, Brent, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think one thing is to sort of take a step back and look at why this is a big deal and why it's called the Sputnik moment too. I think that's kind of helpful, especially for history buffs. Basically, what the Sputnik moment had when in late 1950s, when the Soviet Union launched a satellite, what that was, that set off the space race that we had in the 1960s. And what that indicated is that was a dual use technology then, just like AI is a dual use technology now. And what that meant is that the Soviet Union had delivery systems where it could send nuclear weapons on missiles across the planet. The new wave of warfare is going to be in AI. That's the leading edge. And you look at the AI diffusion rules that just came out, the reasons for these were for national security. And it's not just national security. These are applications for weapons of mass destruction, biological, which include biological weapons, also for developing high-end hacking applications as well. And we've seen it documented where there have been state actors that have been hacking into the utility grids of the United States, trying to get in a position where if there's a conflict, the lights could be turned, lights and water could be turned off for U.S. military bases as well. So the stakes are high in this. And that's why I think it's good to look at this as a Sputnik moment. And that's what's going to be driving all the issues politically in DC and then for compliance in companies.
Let me change a little bit of the focus to business, though, because one of the things that struck me about the announcement was that DeepSeek claimed to have developed this technology at a cost of about 1/10 or even 1/20th of what OpenAI or ChatGPT or other systems, Claude, have cost in development. And that this sent literally shockwaves on the business side of things. And as anyone would know, if your competitor can sell what you sell at 1/10 of the cost, they're going to make a whole lot more money in profit. And so what did this do to the business side, the stock market, NVIDIA, and other companies in this AI space. What shock did you see on them?
It was a huge shock, Tom. I think that immediately across the board, companies in the AI space saw a drop in their stock prices, particularly NVIDIA. I think that reflected an initial bit of panic or confusion, even about what exactly had been the innovation and what part of the AI business model had the innovation really occurred in. You saw, I think, already a little bit of a rebound in some of these stocks, but then that was followed by another dip when there were some announcements related to enforcement around these, or at least investigations by U.S. authorities, as reported by Bloomberg, into how and when and did they do so legally? Did DeepSeek obtain, compute the chips necessary to do this? They have stated publicly that they are using chips that they were perfectly allowed to import and that others were perfectly allowed to export to them at the time that happened. So while the controls have tightened and might today have restricted some of that there was no illegality in the import. But that's something that the authorities are looking at. So it's been a bit of a roller coaster for the tech stocks this past week.
For me, that's been an interesting debate, at least in the media. Was there actual violation of U.S. export laws, or was there a loophole? And the NVIDIA chip H800 was sold to multiple end users in Singapore. And apparently by hook, nook, or crook, those chips got to China. Now, movement of goods is a well-known ploy in the export control world. And I think often, or when I saw that, I thought about a U.S. ally, Dubai, where technology, energy, or other products were shipped during the last 20 years that somehow made it to Iraq or Iran. And there's a famous case of a truck that got sold outside of Houston, and it appeared on a video with the plumber's name and phone number. And so how do we start to think? And NVIDIA's response is, we've done nothing wrong. We expect our distributors to follow the law. That made me almost pull my hair out. You don't expect somebody, you monitor that somebody. And if you have a huge amount of shipments, maybe you ought to look at it. If you have one doctor prescribing more opioids for the entire town, maybe you ought to look at who he's prescribing them to. Does any of that resonate with you guys, or are you even having those conversations with clients around these kinds of issues?
Of course, Tom. I think on the NVIDIA point, I don't think anybody's thinking that somebody in the trade compliance or legal teams there sat and deliberately wanted to do anything wrong. And even the H800s could have been shipped to them, depending on the timing and the export control parameters involved. What this really puts a lot of pressure on is how comfortable are you with distributors and resellers? And again, we don't know anything publicly about the particular ones there, but people are stepping back and looking at these broader trends. This is something Brent and I have been writing about for the NYU program, Corporate Compliance Enforcement, for some time, with Brent's original article in August of 2023, where loopholes lead to liability, which really requires a recalibration of risk and a realization that even if legally you might not, strictly speaking, own the liability, politically, reputationally, in the media, you might get tarred and feathered with it. But Brent, why don't you pick up and tie this back to your original post?
That's right. The original post was titled "When Loopholes Create Liability Pitfalls," and actually, depending upon the fact and circumstances of particular situations and transactions, what may be perceived as a loophole actually is going to create a liability pitfall. And that's where it comes into applying the high probability standard of awareness, the full definition of knowledge, according to the export administration regulations that we've been writing about. And then that's, I think, what's important for companies to look at is that, and what we're talking with a number of them is how are they incorporating this high probability standard into their compliance program. The government's looking at definitely applying that for enforcement, and you see that reflected in a report that was issued by the majority staff of the Senate's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations on December 18th, where they specifically called out BIS for not using the full extent of the law in terms of enforcement. And in fact, they called it, the report said that the export controls are strong on paper, but weak in practice. And we can see where this is coming with the incoming Secretary Lutnick and the priority of the new administration with its America First trade policy. The tariff issues aside, in the latest news with Canada and Mexico, but in the America First trade policy, it does single out the competition with China, and it does call for strengthening and closing those loopholes in export controls.
And Tom, what's really going on here is the high probability standard, it does a lot of things that are interesting and challenging. It makes it easier for the government to bring cases because they don't have to prove actual knowledge. And it's a bit of an elastic line. It's not a bright line, and it moves as the world moves. Media reports, things that happen to your competitors, even if those are allegations or rumors and haven't really been founded yet in confirmed facts or adjudicated facts, the government will still, with the benefit of hindsight, when something bad has happened, look back and say, clearly you were on an awareness of high probability because of X, Y, and Z. And that's the real challenge for both management and compliance teams these days. The standard does allow you, however, to use similar probabilistic determinations in deciding where you direct your compliance resources and what you do with them. So that's the salt in the stew, as I've heard Brent say before, is recognizing that increased enforcement threat under this more lax and loose standard, but coupling that with the compliance playbook under the high probability regime that all of us have seen work out over the last 20 years of FCPA enforcement where the same standard exists.
I'd like to spend a little bit of time on that because I want our listeners to take away several things from this podcast. But number one, as a compliance professional, what can they do? And Mike, I've heard you talk about, I love the recalibration of risk phrase, but also having a framework in place which allows you to recalibrate. And that's what I thought was so significant about DeepSeek for the corporate compliance professional, separate and apart from perhaps the regulatory discussions we'll have down the road. So could you help us understand, or both of you guys help the compliance professional understand, you just laid out some basics, read the newspaper, listen to rumors, look at what your competitors are doing, but how can you put a framework in place that allows you to respond to those risks?
Sure. The real challenge here is none of us, for the police, we're certainly not the intelligence community. We're all guessing. We're all guessing all the time. And the more experience you have, maybe the easier it looks. It certainly doesn't feel easy ever. The challenge is, the way we like to describe the challenge, Tom, is trying to develop an objective framework within which you can make repeated subjective judgments that then you can recalibrate or adjust as the world changes around you. The real challenge, and I'll transition into Brent here because this is really his specialty, is making sure that the inputs that go into that process are reliable and verifiable. As I think we mentioned on another pod, you can ask the guy on floor 37B in the Skyrise in Hong Kong, hey, can I get another end-use certificate? He'll give you 10 of them. He'll give you 20 of them. So how do you actually cause a differentiation in your assessment of risk that's meaningful and that you can defend? Again, we're all worried about what happens 5 years from now when it turns out something bad happened that we didn't intend to happen, but something bad happened. But Brent, why don't you talk about the inputs and how to find good ones?
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk about the inputs, and then just before I talk about the inputs, I'd like to just take a step back and look at how to prioritize compliance issues. And one of the things is just look at where the world is heading, and then I think that helps to put things in context and what's going to be coming up on deck. I mean, as former Assistant Secretary for Enforcement Matt Axelrod said, the world has changed and we must all change with it. So we're not living in the world of 20 years ago. Definitely like in 2001 when China joined the World Trade Organization, we're in a very different world right now. So that's one thing to sort of keep in mind and to think in terms of priority, because sometimes in the world of business and even compliance, people are focused on the last battle, and they need to look at where the next one is going to be. Now we go at this kind of takes us to this issue of inputs. For a long time, it was people would rely on representations. Companies would rely on representations from their customers and business partners that they were in compliance with relevant laws and regulations. That just doesn't work anymore, especially in this context. And you can see where this is breaking down. You can see it in the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, the FLIPA, where the guidance that came out of Department of Homeland Security, to which the Department of Commerce also put its seal on, is that it doesn't accept labor audits done in the People's Republic of China because they're unreliable. And so when you have these issues that are coming down to, driven by very big geopolitical tailwinds, then it comes down to looking at what these inputs are. You can just, take it back to the FCPA world, and you go back in the early days of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and we're saying, okay, you've got some questionable agent out there. It's like, do y'all give any bribes? And they say, no. Okay, that's it, done. That's laughable. And so we're in that world now with export controls. And so now it's an issue of looking at what inputs are going to be reliable and what intelligence you can put together through open source information and what you can gather in your own efforts and interviews, and collaborate that information and come to a level. And this is where it comes to applying that high probability standard, comes to a level of comfort or discomfort in certain ones, business deals. You're just going to have to find something better.
Yeah, Tom, some specific examples of what we're getting at here are things like, how have trade flows changed over time? And you see that's also something the media has started to pick up as well. Is what you're sending to a particular country or location feasible of being used in country? And whether if it's because the country's power grid can't support that number of chips, or just because the industrial base isn't there for that product. That would be something that would be relevant to a meaningful risk-based assessment. The other thing, Tom, is it's important to differentiate compliance program design from responding to red flags. If you're shipping millions of products a week into the global economy, and it's still today a global economy, despite the signs it's pulling into at least 2 different blocks, you have to rely on certifications. You have to rely on information provided by other counterparties. Otherwise, it just all grounds to a halt. But where you see red flags indicating a higher risk of evasion or diversion, then you do need to look at it a bit more closely, and you need to find those inputs that are going to be defensible, that are not just limited to what that person's saying. Another one might be that for certain transactions, don't just look at what's in the compliance file. Look at what's in Salesforce. Look what's in the sales team's files, because unfortunately, U.S. authorities will instinctively and automatically impute to the legal entity the collective knowledge of every single employee. It's not just about what the compliance teams know. It's what did the sales team know? What did the tax team know? What did the other people know? If there's other things going on where there may be documentation shared that may not find its way to the compliance teams. You can't do that. You don't have time to do that for every single transaction. But when you see these red flags present, or you see a media report, those are the types of things that when you go back, very practically speaking, you can apply, you can draw from. This really, Tom, steps back again, you take another step back to the DOJ guidelines for effective corporate compliance programs. Sometimes you get lost in the weeds if you're focused on export controls, if you're focused on Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. There are some core principles that will really determine how the DOJ views your company and what it considers to be an appropriate outcome of an investigation into the actions of your employees or agents based on whether they think you have an effective compliance program or not. And it's doing that risk assessment in mitigating your greatest risks. There's some anecdotal statements, I think, in the export control bar in particular that raise doubt as to whether there's an affirmative obligation to find and then mitigate red flags. You may not find it exactly there, particularly in some legacy documents or programs. Certainly in today's guidance, the BIS, the Department of Commerce, think you do have an obligation to look for and mitigate those. But even then, stepping back, if any corporation has an expectation under the DOJ guidelines, which again, not the law, but they determine whether you get prosecuted and if you do get investigated, what the outcome might be, to identify your risks and mitigate them. Then we talked, Tom, on an earlier pod about the McDonald's decisions in Delaware and how there's actually a duty of oversight under Delaware law for corporations organized under Delaware law, whose state of incorporation pulls from that law, to identify core compliance risks. Certainly, if you're exporting these days into these countries and you see some of these alerts in the media and otherwise, this might elevate that to a core compliance risk or a central compliance risk.
There's a couple of things you said that I really want to drill down on, and they relate to, this is not simply a framework at 30,000 feet. This is not simply a chief compliance officer, but this is a level of oversight and monitoring that should be up and down the organization, which to me means training. And I'm going to pick up on a person in Hong Kong with the end user certificate based upon the following story that happened to me. For my sins, it's little well known, but I was once appointed an export control director for a corporation. And one day, the shipping clerk came to me and said, I was looking at these two end user certificates, and these signatures look exactly alike. And it's for different corporations. And that was simply the shipping clerk looking on his own. I'd like to claim I trained him, but I think he was there long before I got there. And he literally stopped us from shipping something fraudulently. So you can have that kind of training because your compliance can go all the way down. You talked about tax, you talked about business, you talked about ops, but literally all the way down. The second point I would like to emphasize to our compliance brethren and sistren is one of the effective hallmarks of an effective compliance program for the chief compliance officer and the compliance function is resources, oversight, and authority. We typically focused on the resources, headcount, the oversight, do you have board visibility, and are you competent in your job? But now I think we're moving towards resources, and that means data analytics, tools which can look at, as you said, Mike, millions of transactions a month and spot those red flags. And so I hope our compliance professionals can utilize this to make the case, the business case of why they need open AI tools, why they need more and better data analytics tools, because you can't review 1 million transactions a month. It's just physically not possible. I hope our listeners will understand this is a comprehensive framework and a comprehensive solution, literally up and down the chain.
Absolutely, Tom. And maybe I'll let Brent take up the baton here in a second. But how many times, Tom, have people talked about the importance of culture, and particularly a speak up culture? If that clerk hadn't just had the courage to raise the question and just thought, I don't know, they won't believe me, or this is going to cause me to get into trouble because then the shipment gets delayed, you never would have known. And until maybe it was too late. But Brent, what's your reaction, Brent?
Yeah, I mean, it's part of it is also training on how things have changed. And I think part of it is in training up and down the organization in terms of how the high probability standard is going to be incorporated into the company's compliance program to protect the company and its individuals and protect the company's business. So I think that part is important. Another piece to kind of think about too, that I've experienced when I've been in compliance roles, particularly in-house, is talking about the value that compliance can bring to the organization. And there's a saying in Chinese, 东方不亮西方亮. So when the East is not bright, the West is bright, which means, look, in the world of business, there are always new opportunities that are coming, and you can see where those investments are going to go. Now, we talked about earlier in the pod about what's the impact on DeepSeek and how it's going to affect the compute part of the whole AI piece. DeepSeek's just raised the bar. And so the efficiencies that may have come forth in DeepSeek's own innovation, those can be applied to the frontier. So everything's going to go up. And so where the issue is at is like, who has the compute power? And those are chips, those are data centers, that's a physical infrastructure. And so look at where those dollars are going to be invested. We've got the Stargate project coming in. You've got definitely as part of, again, the America First trade policy is that putting those investments in the United States. And so one of the things too is to show that if you've got a decent compliance program that can help you in the risky areas around the world, it also puts you in pole position to show that you're a good corporate citizen here for those opportunities in the U.S. and other U.S. allies.
So I'm going to take a break here.